What was his voice like? It was not a nice stentorian, deep voice. It was rather high-pitched. But that high pitch actually made it carry. And this is how he could learn to address people from great distance. It was said that Lincoln overcame sort of the fatigue that travelers felt in the circuit. Remember I told you a few minutes ago how he'd ride the circuit? Lincoln was the equivalent of a rock star as a lawyer. He and Judge Davis would go around Illinois and they'd hear their cases and Lincoln would argue. But what was happening is that at night they would retire to the tavern and they would tell stories to each other. Well, Lincoln always told the greatest stories, the funniest stories, and he became this rock star as he went around the state of Illinois entertaining people. And of course the circuit riders in those days, you had 3 months in the spring and 3 months in the fall. So people's appetites for his stories would be whetted in that 3 or 4 month absence before Lincoln would come back and tell his stories. He also knew, again, remember where I'm going with this. He had been, he knew that he was not a pleasant person to look at. So he knew that to develop as a courtroom lawyer, as a trial lawyer, that he had to be a very skilled rhetorician. And Lincoln would hang around courthouses. He would learn how the good lawyers won their cases, and he saw confirmed exactly where his skill set lay. He saw that people who made the best argument, told the best story, often won the arguments. Now, lawyers have gone back and looked at the hundreds and hundreds of cases that Lincoln argued. And lawyers, looking back at it, say it's not always necessarily on the merits of the law, or the case at hand, that Lincoln won on. He was able to persuade juries, again, because of the stories he could tell. And I think the people like Michael Burlingame or David Herbert Donald or Ronald White, the great biographers of Lincoln, Carl Sandburg, who looked at Lincoln's life, have seen that this magnificent storytelling ability probably has its roots in the fact that he had to reach out to people in some way because he was not naturally going to be approached. So that was something else he overcame quite successfully, and partly his weakness is a tremendous strength over 54, 55 years. The last obstacle, the fifth obstacle I want to talk about, is also internal. Poverty. Now, most of you are thinking, wait a second, poverty is an external condition. Yes, it's true. Lincoln had a great deal of physical poverty around him, and it was terrible hardship for him to live on the frontier. Remember, this is an environment in which we have accounts of this from the Lincoln household. You and your dad are out and you plant the seeds. The rain comes along and washes all the seeds away. This actually happened in the Lincoln family. Ergo, no crops. You're not going to have a harvest. This is life and death on the frontier. We also know, obviously from the primitive medical conditions out on the frontier, that if you make a mistake, you die. You can't just call 911. You can't just get in a car or get on a horse and go to a hospital. This kind of poverty, obviously, is in the exterior surrounding Lincoln. He lived in a cabin that was about the size of this section of chairs, 16 by 20 at most. 16 by 20 at most. If you look at the cabins his father built. About the size of your living room. That's where all the family activities went on. But I think that the kind of poverty that Abraham Lincoln really had to contend with was emotional poverty. And this thought is not original with me. This comes from Michael Burlingame, who goes into great depth, and other people have written about Lincoln's depression. So this is that second interior, sort of the having to deal with the ugliness of your appearance, and then having to deal with the temperament that I think today we call manic depressive. It was exacerbated in those days because Lincoln lost so many key people in his life to death. His mother dies when he's just 9 years old, and she dies a horrible death. It's something called the milk sickness. Cows go out, they eat a noxious weed, you consume the milk, and you die a week later. And it's an ugly death. Doctors have described it. eyes roll into the back of your head, your limbs swell, your tongue turns black, you become delirious, you don't recognize the people around you, you sweat in the cold of winter, you feel like an ice cube in the heat of summer. It is a terrible, agonizing death. This poor 9-year-old boy is watching his very mother expire this painful death. And then, after she dies, he has to help his dad make the casket. The mortise and tenon joints, the care with which he has made, he's thinking about who's going to be there. His mother, whose touch he could count on, will now be cold touch to the wood. He loses his mom. He's very close to his sister. But when he's 19 years old, his sister, who's a couple years older, she marries. She dies in childbirth, so he loses a beloved sister. The family loses a baby boy shortly after birth. So these are all losses. You would think in this atmosphere of loss that somebody in the nuclear family would be left who would be close to Abraham Lincoln. Who was left? Dad. Was it a good relationship? Absolutely not. It was a horrible relationship. Thomas Lincoln is somebody we would today call a cracker. He was a very simple man who liked to tell some stories, but he wasn't nearly as smart as his son. He basically was lazy, was not ambitious to improve really the lot of his family as much as the neighbors. In fact, one of the neighbors later said, after Abraham Lincoln became famous, that the Lincoln family back on the frontier was a fine specimen of white trash. That's Thomas Lincoln's family. And Thomas Lincoln, I think, carried some of the resentment and took it out on his son. He wanted his son to help him succeed as a farmer. Abraham Lincoln didn't want to have anything to do with farming. Abraham Lincoln wanted to choose a different life. Remember, Henry Clay's his ideal. Henry Clay wants to pursue, he wants America to develop industrial. Any of you who heard my talk on Alexander Hamilton a couple of years ago, you see the direct line of descent. Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln. You make it in commerce or in the legal profession or any one of the learned professions. You don't go and get your hands dirty and farm. And as soon as Abraham Lincoln has a chance to get out of his father's household, he does so. Takes a raft of goods down to New Orleans to try to sell, and he ends up working in a store. He makes a statement. Why? Because he didn't fit in. Any child who is not quite fit into the family knows the pain that Abraham Lincoln would have gone through. Let's give some examples. Abraham Lincoln had a tender heart. He did not like to hunt. This is a man on the frontier. Do you know anybody on the frontier who wouldn't like to hunt? You know, a boy? Oh. When he was 7 years old, he thought he should man up. He thought he should hunt. So he takes a rifle, a long rifle, and when there are turkeys out in the yard in front of the little cabin, he shoots one of them, and he feels horrible for killing the bird. Terrible. That shotgun back there in that case, he wouldn't have wanted to have anything to do with it. And he resolved never to kill large game again after that. He had a tender heart. Well, his father didn't like that at all. If you're going to be out on the frontier here, if you're going to make it, you got to learn to shoot a gun, you got to learn to shoot deer. And, I don't want this tender heart business. Lincoln did not, young Abraham did not fit in. He didn't like to fight. He fought if he had to, and on the frontier, a young man developing blooming into manhood had to learn to take care of himself. But every time somebody thought that he was not quite man enough to fight, he'd whip him. It was because he had the real long arms. So, he could just kind of keep them at bay, and he didn't want to hurt anybody, though. This was a man who didn't fit in. He wasn't what you would call sort of a macho man's man. He wasn't interested in that. And his father took it out on him. Here's also a boy. Again, I emphasize, this is a boy on the frontier. This is where books are rare. And what did this boy want to do? He wanted to pick up books and he wanted to read. He did not fit in.